April 14, 1947. In a narrow courtroom inside the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and unspoken fatigue. The war had been over for 2 years, yet its ghosts still filled every chair. A middle-aged Wehrmacht officer, uniform faded to gray, stood trembling before the bench. His right hand shook as he gripped the wooden rail, 2 fingers missing, a memory of Tunisia, where a shell had ended both his command and his certainty. The American judge, Colonel Edward Lawson, adjusted his glasses and looked up. "Do you have anything to say before sentence?" The officer swallowed hard. The interpreter waited. But instead of excuses or ideology, there came a quiet voice. "I am sorry I learned honor too late." The sound seemed to dissolve in the courtroom. Reporters forgot to write. The guards froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lawson closed the folder before him, slowly, deliberately, as if shutting the last page of a tragedy. He stood, and instead of delivering condemnation, he bowed his head, a gesture that broke every protocol, yet made perfect sense to everyone who saw it. There were no explosions, no banners, no marching bands, only that fragile silence between 2 men who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Outside, the ruins of Nuremberg baked under a weak spring sun. Children played among bricks that once formed the Reich's grand architecture, while pigeons settled on statues that no longer represented power. Inside, a man who had believed in conquest now faced the cost of conscience. Reporters later wrote that the judge's movement was barely visible but unforgettable. The officer's file listed his name, Major Karl Rehmann, Afrika Korps. He had commanded supply convoys near Kasserine Pass, where he lost most of his unit. His war was a collage of dust, hunger, and discipline, until capture showed him a different kind of order. Some witnesses claimed they saw a faint smile on his lips when the sentence, a reduced term due to humanitarian conduct, was announced. Others swore his hands continued to shake, not from fear, but from disbelief that mercy still existed. In that moment, the world's hatred felt suspended, like dust caught in sunlight. For those who survived the war, the question lingered. Could remorse ever rewrite the past? Could a single act of humility redeem the millions swallowed by ideology? As the courtroom emptied, one American reporter wrote in his notes, "Today the war ended again, not with surrender, but with a handshake waiting to happen." If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. History feels closer when we share the same moment across the world. The train that carried Major Karl Rehmann to captivity in 1943 rattled through the night like a tired heartbeat. The war had just turned against Germany in North Africa. The Afrika Korps, once Rommel's pride, was dissolving under the weight of American logistics. Of the 250,000 Axis soldiers captured in Tunisia, 130,000 were German. They filled ships bound for an unknown land, each man clutching the last symbol of order, his uniform. Rehmann had commanded a transport column near Kasserine Pass. When fuel ran out, he organized the wounded, surrendered his pistol, and told his men not to destroy their trucks. "Machines can serve peace too," he had said. That line, noted by an American sergeant, would resurface years later in a courtroom file marked character testimony. The crossing to the United States took 3 weeks. On deck, the prisoners saw the Statue of Liberty from afar. Some jeered, others fell silent. One officer whispered, "If they feed us, it's propaganda." They were wrong. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, each prisoner received a blanket, a medical exam, and coffee. Real coffee, not roasted barley. It confused them more than capture itself. The camp's routines mirrored the American Army's own: roll call at dawn, labor details, English lessons, and most bewildering, film nights showing democratic ideals. On Sundays, local families sometimes visited, bringing cakes baked by church groups. One Mississippi farmer's wife told a guard, "If we treat them like animals, we'll only raise beasts again." Her words spread among prisoners like a rumor of decency. Rehmann kept a small notebook. In neat engineer's handwriting, he recorded camp life. July 9th, rations fair, treatment correct, guards polite. July 12th, listen to lecture. The Bill of Rights. Hard to believe citizens argue with government and stay alive. His disbelief carried no sarcasm. It was fascination. There were moments of friction, too. A Nazi loyalist accused him of being too American already. That night, the man's barrack window shattered. No one saw who threw the stone. The next morning, Rehmann wrote only, "It begins again, even here." Across the barbed wire, American soldiers repaired trucks beside captured German mechanics. They compared tools, argued over tolerances, and ended up laughing at how similar their slang was. For the first time, Rehmann realized his enemies also measured the world in millimeters, in grease and precision. Humanity hid in the details. By the winter of 1944, he had stopped counting days. Instead, he counted conversations. The sergeant who taught him baseball rules, the preacher who said, "Redemption isn't rationed," the interpreter who shared black market chocolate. When news of Germany's collapse reached Camp Shelby in May 1945, no one cheered, no one cursed. The men just sat quietly, listening to a radio that seemed to broadcast the end of everything. In that silence, the seeds of the trial were already planted. The Americans had taught their captives something unexpected, not fear, but contrast. And contrast would be the most powerful witness when the war finally demanded explanation. The files that built a man's fate often began with photographs. In the Nuremberg Annex courtroom, where secondary trials continued through 1946 and 1947, they lay scattered like silent witnesses. Rows of corpses, collapsed trenches, execution pits. The prosecutor that morning held up one such photograph, a group of prisoners kneeling, hands bound. "This," he said, "is the record of your army's honor." The room stiffened. Then, unexpectedly, the defendant asked to speak. Major Karl Rehmann, no longer the proud officer of Tunisia, but a gaunt man in a civilian jacket, reached into a small envelope. He placed a different photograph on the table. It showed a battlefield crater, two men huddled under a splintered wagon, one in a German uniform, the other unmistakably American. "That is me," Rehmann said quietly. "And that man beside me was Private Charles Morrison of the U.S. Army." The judge leaned forward. "Explain." Rehmann's voice trembled. "He was screaming in the bombardment. I didn't save him because he was American. I saved him because he screamed like my brother." For a moment, even the interpreter forgot her duty. The echo of those words filled the room, heavier than artillery. Somewhere behind the prosecutor's desk, a typewriter clacked once, then stopped. Later testimony confirmed parts of the story. Morrison had indeed been captured during a confused skirmish near Fade Pass in February 1943. Records from a field hospital showed he survived, treated for leg wounds. A U.S. medic had noted, "Enemy officer assisted evacuation under fire." The file, buried in archives, had resurfaced only weeks before this hearing. Photographers in the press gallery whispered to each other. One said, "That's the first time I've seen a defendant hold up evidence of mercy." Another muttered, "Mercy doesn't fit on a charge sheet." The image of Rehmann shielding an American soldier became a paradox that unsettled everyone present. How could the same uniform be both executioner and protector? The contradiction gnawed at the courtroom's certainty. Even the prosecutor, a young captain from Chicago who had lost 2 cousins in Europe, lowered his gaze. That evening, a French journalist wrote in Le Monde, "It was not the photograph that mattered, but the silence that followed it." In that silence, the war seemed to realize it had gone too far to call itself human. Rehmann was led back to his cell. The photograph returned to his hands. He stared at it under the dim light, tracing the blurred faces. He remembered the cry, the dust, the absurd calm that came after pulling a stranger to safety. He had not thought of it as redemption then, only instinct. But now it was the only defense he had. Outside, Nuremberg's church bells rang 6 o'clock. Somewhere, a typist resumed her work, the keys clicking like distant rain. A man's life was reduced to evidence measured in ink and photographs, yet for those who saw that picture, it was enough to wonder whether humanity could survive even within its own crimes. The day the verdict came, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and fatigue. Months of testimonies had worn everyone down. The judge, Colonel Edward Lawson, was a man who had fought in the Pacific before becoming a jurist. His left shoulder carried a bullet scar from Okinawa. His right carried the weight of judgment. As he read the closing notes, he saw before him not an ideology but a man, frail and exhausted, whose war had ended long before the guns fell silent. Major Karl Rehmann knelt beside his defense counsel, head bowed. His sentence would determine whether he left prison alive. Lawson paused, rereading the final witness statement, the one from Private Morrison, the American soldier whom Rehmann had protected. Morrison had written, "He dragged me to shelter, shouting that no flag matters when man bleeds." The court translator had hesitated when reading it aloud, her voice shaking. When Lawson finally spoke, his tone was flat yet heavy. "The court finds mitigating evidence of humane conduct under enemy fire. The accused is hereby sentenced to time served and immediate release under supervision." The room exhaled. Rehmann didn't rise. He clasped his hands, trembling, not believing what he'd heard. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers. Then, quietly, the judge did something unheard of in military protocol. He removed his robe, set down his gavel, and stepped down from the bench. Every journalist present later wrote a different version of what happened next, but all agreed on one fact. Lawson extended his hand. The German officer stared, stunned, before slowly reaching out. Their handshake lasted only a few seconds, yet the silence around it felt infinite. Lawson said softly, "The world can rise again only if men like you dare to fall." The meaning was layered: admission, surrender, courage. A soldier acknowledging another, not for what he had done, but for what he had unlearned. Flashes from cameras froze the moment. A photo appeared days later in Stars and Stripes under the headline, "Judge breaks protocol, extends hand to enemy." Some readers called it disgraceful. Others mailed letters of admiration. One veteran wrote, "I wish I could shake the hand of every man who learned too late." For Rehmann, the gesture was overwhelming. He wept openly. To him, the handshake felt heavier than chains. In that instant, judgment transformed into reconciliation, a rare mutation of justice that no law could define. As he was escorted out, he turned once more toward the bench. Lawson was still standing, eyes lowered, perhaps wondering if he had just forgiven too much or just enough. The guards led the prisoner away through the side corridor, past the cracked windows where the evening light bled across the marble floor like spilled gold. No one clapped, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow click of the judge's cane as he walked out, breaking the silence of history itself. The following morning brought a new witness, a thin, elderly man in a black cassock, his steps careful but steady. The bailiff called his name, Father Władysław Korczak, Kraków, Poland. Few in the room recognized it, but Rehmann did. The priest had been one of hundreds of forced laborers under his command in late 1944 when the German army retreated through Silesia. The memory struck like lightning. When Father Korczak took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward. He had been imprisoned in a makeshift camp near Oppeln, where starvation was common and executions casual. The prosecutor's first question was sharp. "Father, do you recognize the defendant?" The priest looked at Rehmann for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes. He commanded the depot. I remember his voice." "Were you afraid of him?" Korczak's reply came after a pause that felt longer than any silence before it. "No, because he once gave me bread when I was dying." The sound of typing stopped. A guard shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed in the gallery. The judge's pen froze mid-air. Korczak continued, voice trembling but clear. "I was weak with fever. I had stolen a crust of potato peel and was caught. I thought they would hang me. But he, Major Rehmann, told the guard to let me go. Later, he came to the infirmary and gave me a piece of bread from his own ration. It was small, but it was the first act of mercy I saw in that place. I am alive because of it." Lawson looked toward the defendant. Rehmann's eyes were downcast, hands clasped. He did not try to defend himself. The priest's memory was both his salvation and his punishment. When asked why he had come all the way from Poland to testify, Korczak answered simply, "Because I heard men call him monster, and I needed to say that once he was human." The court fell utterly silent. Even the interpreter hesitated, afraid her translation might break the spell of those words. The prosecutor closed his folder. There was nothing left to challenge. No legal argument could outweigh bread shared in a death camp. Justice, for a moment, shed its armor and revealed a face. Outside the courtroom, reporters ran to send cables. One wrote for the Times, a priest saved by his oppressor, and now saving him again, this time with truth. Later, in a corridor lined with peeling plaster, Father Korczak and Rehmann met briefly under the dim light. They did not speak. The priest simply touched his shoulder, the same way he might bless a dying man. Then he left, his cassock brushing against the cold stone. For the audience listening now, one question lingers. If the man who suffered most could forgive first, what excuse do the rest of us have to keep hating? The final afternoon of the hearing began under a pale Bavarian sky. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows. Major Karl Rehmann sat alone at the defendant's table, the weight of every witness still echoing inside him. He had been spared the gallows, yet the word freedom felt foreign, like a medal he no longer deserved. When the guards entered, one of them carried a small brown box. It was marked Personal Effects, 1943, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Inside were the few things taken from him at capture, a rusted compass, a photograph of 2 children, and a half-burned Bible bound in cracked leather. The guard placed it gently before him. Rehmann touched the cover, brushing away ash that had fused to the paper years ago. The first page was warped, but a faint inscription remained. To Karl, so you never lose your way. Mother. For the first time since the verdict, his composure broke. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks. He whispered, almost to himself, I thought it burned with my soul. The courtroom was still. Even the judge looked away, giving him privacy inside that moment. A camera clicked once, capturing not guilt or triumph, but the bewilderment of a man rediscovering his own humanity. Across the aisle, the American guard who had escorted him from camp shifted uneasily. Later, he would say that seeing a German officer cry over a Bible shook him more than any combat memory. We took everything from them, he wrote to his wife, but maybe they're learning to give something back. Remorse. Rehmann held the book against his chest as if cradling a wounded bird. Around him, the machinery of justice slowed, pens stopped, boots quieted, voices softened. For one suspended heartbeat, the tribunal felt less like a court and more like a confessional. Outside, the city of Nuremberg hummed with post-war reconstruction. Trams screeching, children chasing each other through rubble. Inside, an ex-soldier wept over a relic of faith, and every spectator felt the invisible line between good and evil blur slightly. It was not the acquittal that moved them, but the recognition that something long buried in the ruins of Europe had stirred again, the capacity to be forgiven. So, viewers, I'll ask you directly, if you had stood there that day, watching an enemy cry over his mother's Bible, would you have felt anger or pity? Could you tell which belonged to justice and which to mercy? Years later, long after Nuremberg's echoes had faded into archives and headlines, a letter crossed the Atlantic. It was dated October 1952, written on the letterhead of the United States Military Government Office in Frankfurt. The envelope bore a shaky return address, Colonel Edward Lawson, return. The recipient's name was unfamiliar to most historians, Heinrich Rehmann, Munich, the son of the officer whose trembling hand had once held a courtroom silent. Inside the paper was thin, the ink uneven, as if written in hesitation more than haste. The letter read, "When I shook your father's hand, I did not free a German. I freed a man from history's chains. I have judged many, condemned some, acquitted few. But that day, I saw something greater than verdicts, the collapse of hatred inside a single human being." The letter continued for a page and a half. Lawson confessed that he had never spoken publicly about the trial again. He had retired quietly, bought a small farm in Vermont, and spent his days repairing fences and reading scripture. But in the evenings, he said, he kept a photograph on his desk, not of his family or comrades, but of that silent handshake taken by a Stars and Stripes reporter in May 1947. "It reminds me," he wrote, "that justice without mercy is only power in uniform." Heinrich, then in his 20s, had grown up in a Germany rebuilding itself with cement and silence. His father rarely spoke of the war, yet on the anniversary of the trial each spring, he would sit by the window and place the burned Bible on the sill, pages fluttering in the wind. When the letter arrived, Heinrich read it aloud to him. Rehmann listened, eyes closed, nodding slowly, as if each word sealed an old wound. After Lawson's death in 1954, the letter was found again among Rehmann's belongings. He had underlined one sentence in faint pencil: "Some wars end on paper, others end when one hand dares to meet another." That line became his epitaph when he was buried near Würzburg in 1963. American veterans passing through Germany sometimes left flowers at the grave, saying they remembered the story from newspapers their fathers had kept. In the archives of the Dachau Memorial, the letter still exists, folded, yellowed, fragile as forgiveness itself. Curators display it beside that photograph. Two men, one in uniform, one in robe, hands clasped, both eyes lowered. Visitors often linger, whispering as if afraid to disturb the peace those men had finally earned. No music plays there, only footsteps and the sound of paper rustling. History, for once, feels human. When the lights dim in the courthouse of history, what remains is not the verdict, but the silence that follows. That silence, stretched between guilt and grace, is where humanity survives. Major Karl Rehmann's story was not about absolution. It was about a man learning that honor discovered too late is still worth having. His trial ended with words few remembered, but with gestures none could forget. A trembling hand, a bowed head, a Bible returned, and above all, a handshake that carried the weight of 2 continents trying to become human again. Numbers define war: 60 million dead, 400 cities destroyed, 6,000 trials convened. Yet no statistic explains what mercy costs. At Nuremberg, every wall still smelled of smoke. Every gavel strike carried the memory of screams. And yet, amid all that ruin, one American judge and one German officer proved that compassion could stand upright in a place built for punishment. They were, in their quiet way, architects of a peace far sturdier than any treaty. Historians debate what made the Nuremberg tribunals endure. Some say it was the legal precedent, others the moral reckoning. But perhaps it was something smaller, a moment when a man once sworn to conquer accepted defeat, not as humiliation but as purification. The war had burned away his illusions, leaving only the ash of truth. From that ash, he built something no regime could command: dignity without pride, remorse without despair. There are nights, veterans said, when the sound of that courtroom still echoes in dreams. The scrape of a chair, the quiver of a voice saying, "I am sorry I learned honor too late." It is in those echoes that war truly ends, not with armies withdrawing, but with a heart finally surrendering to its own conscience. So if one day you stand before another's pain, enemy or friend, remember this: history does not heal by forgetting. It heals when one hand dares to meet another.